All right. Welcome everyone to our first ever river advocate training. My name is Dara. I'm the program associate for community resilience at the Charles River Watershed. We'll have a little bit of an intro, or kind of an intro slide a little bit later, but Robert, if you want to go to the next slide. I'm frozen.
You got it, Dira?
Sorry, was I frozen?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, we lost Dira. That's okay. We can, so just, I'm okay rolling. Is it still recording? Do people see it? Oh, Dira's back.
My Wi-Fi is a little spotty today. Let's see. Oh, great. So for today, we're going to start with a quick welcome and introductions. I know people already started their introductions, but we could do another round really quickly. We're going to cover some of the CRWA basics and background, kind of cover what the River Advocates is, and threats to the Charles River that some of you may already know what they are, and next steps in regards to what the River Advocate program is going to be like. And before we get started, I kind of want to cover some of our meeting etiquette. So I see that everyone already has their full name on the Zoom here, but if you also want to add your town, that would be really great, so we know where you're coming from. While we go through our training, please keep your mic muted when you're not speaking, but if you have a question or if you'd like to add something, feel free to select the raise hand tool and then unmute yourself. Next. Robert, next slide.
Yeah, you want me to do the land acknowledgement, Dira?
Sure, yeah. Why don't you do that while I try to figure out my Wi-Fi?
Okay. And if you want to call in, I think that could be good, and I can do the polls if you want to do that for audio. So at the Charles River Watershed, we just want to acknowledge that the Charles River resides on occupied territory of the Massachusetts, the Nipmuc, and the Wampanoag tribes. And we acknowledge and we recognize that the past, the present, and they're the past, the present, and the future caretakers of this land, and they still are here with us today. And we just want to acknowledge that we are on occupied territory of them, of their land. So moving on, just some introductions. I'm Robert Kearns, he, him pronouns, and I'm the climate resilience specialist. I am from Braintree, Mass, but I live in Boston. And Dira, do you hear us, or you good?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay.
Again, my name's Dira Johannes. I'm the program associate for community resilience. I'm actually originally from Malaysia, but I've lived in Boston for the past 7 to 8 years. I also went to UMass Boston to do my undergrad and my master's. And I just recently joined CRWA this past summer.
Awesome. And I just joined too as well this summer. We're both pretty new staff. So some of you may be more familiar with CRWA than others. That being said, we're one of the oldest watershed organizations in the country, founded in 1965 by a group of concerned residents who are concerned about the health of the river. And over the years, the organization has effectively worked to protect and enhance and restore the Charles River from the days-long song dirty water to the beautiful resource that we all cherish today. And obviously, the work continues, and we have a great disciplinary staff team working on the mission every day. In the Charles River watershed is a large geographic area with over 80 miles of river, 20 dams, 35 towns, and over 1 million residents. great team of staff, over 12 staff members. And the goal in this program, River Advocates, is to really build more capacity through more volunteers to help do more work on the local level. And we could not be doing this without the help of volunteers and enthusiastic advocates like you all here tonight. So really thank you for coming. And just where are folks from? And I know this map is not totally representative because some people have joined after I did this map, but we got a geographic distribution of people from Boston, Cambridge, Charlestown, Medfield, Shrewsbury, Wellesley, Rentham, and more. And I apologize if your town's not listed, but that's sort of the geographic representation for tonight. So you may be wondering why we're launching this River Advocate program. And CRWA has really had a lot of success at the federal level and the state level, working with Mass DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, Department of Conservation and Recreation, US EPA, and lobbying efforts for statewide legislation. However, the river is still very impacted by decisions made on the local level. This program is part of our efforts to expand our grassroots bottom-up advocacy and visibility at the local level. And you all are sort of our first cohort, and the program is still evolving. So we appreciate your grace as we start and work on this together. And we see this as an opportunity to complement our work on the Charles River Climate Compact, which is an effort between 24 municipalities in the watershed to collaborate on projects and share information to prepare for a changing climate, as well as our climate resilience trainings, which we do for local elected officials and appointed officials to educate folks on climate change and stormwater pollution. And now I'm going to hand it back off to Dira to talk more about the timeline of the program.
Great. Yeah, I'm going to keep my camera off just so that I have better connection, but apologies
Sounds
for
good.
that. So yeah, this slide just shows a tentative timeline for our River Advocate program. So as you can see, December 2021 is where we're hosting our first River Advocate training. And this is really to kind of cover what the River Advocate volunteer program is and our goals and next steps. We plan to have a workshop in January of 2022, and then a third workshop in March 2022. And as we gather and recruit more River Advocate volunteers, we're hoping to do community calls or group check-ins between those months, so like bi-monthly check-ins. And we really look forward to kind of gaining or hearing from you what kind of discussions and policies and projects that are in your community that you think we should be working on and focusing on. Like Robert said, you guys are the first cohort, so we're really growing this together with you guys. Next slide, Robert. So we have a poll, and I'm going to launch our first poll. So our first question is, what has inspired you guys to become a River Advocate? So why did you guys decide to sign up today? I'll give a minute for people to respond. How many of us are here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, I think we have everybody. All right, so it looks like some of you are here because you really love the Charles River and you want to see it further restored. Some of you have said that you're really concerned about the climate impacts that we see in Boston or within our watershed, and you want to prevent them. And someone included other, whoever included other, if you want to speak up and share what other reasons brought you here, feel free to do so.
That was me.
All right.
Yeah.
Great. I'm so glad that you guys were able to make it. Robert. So as is in the of this training. This is really an amazing volunteer opportunity that we're hoping to expand in our watershed and have more engagement from residents in all our different municipalities. And advocacy has many different meanings, but the definition of advocacy is really the action of any individual or group that questions or argues, supports, or defends a cause. And at CRWA, we advocate for climate resiliency within our watershed, and that is the ability to cope with ongoing climate change and recover from major climate disasters. And when we think about advocacy and being an advocate, really anyone can be an advocate, which is why we're hosting this training today. We're hoping that this can help remove some of the barriers to people that are interested in becoming an advocate in their own community.
Awesome. Now we're going to run our second poll to sort of see what folks have already done. And if you haven't done anything, that's awesome too. We're trying to help, you know, everybody on everybody's learning and on different levels. So I don't know if Dira, you see the poll? Can't see it on my end.
Yep, I just shared it and I see people have already answered. So it looks like everyone here have done a number of different types of advocacy, from lobbying to education, which is really great that you guys have gotten some experience in that and are bringing that to the table today. So the goal of today's training is hopefully to inform you on some of the remaining and emerging threats to the Charles River and its watershed, how climate change exacerbates those threats in our watershed, how to find out what your community is already doing to protect the Charles River and or invest in climate resiliency in your policies and plans. And we're also hoping to show some examples of the policies and plans that protect the Charles River and also build climate resiliency.
Awesome. Thank you, Dira. So when we're talking about background on advocacy, we want to kind of define our terms. So when we're talking about climate change, there's a lot of talk about mitigation, reducing emissions, which is so important, as well as adaptation or reducing the damage and building back better for the future. An analogy I like is, you know, bailing out the boat of water or fixing the leaks. We kind of have to do both. And climate resilience is sort of the best of both. And we have things like nature-based solutions, which help adapt to climate change by reducing emissions via natural greenhouse gas sequestration. So like planting trees and doing dam removals, that sort of thing, and wetlands restoration, for example, can sort of do both. But we do need to do everything in this situation. And the question is why? It's, you know, when we're talking about climate change, it's not new, but new news to folks, but it is a really scary and it's a threat as greenhouse gas emissions are rising exponentially, as you can see on this graph from NASA. And next question is we run another poll and see, question is what type of impacts are you already seeing or experience in your community? So the flooding, heat, extreme weather, droughts. Everybody see the poll?
Yeah, as you can see the results, it looks like everyone has experienced or seen flooding and heat impacts in your community or in your surrounding communities, and as well as extreme weather as one of our top answers.
Awesome. So as we know, oh, Caroline, do you have a question?
I I wanted to also mention another one that's very important to us, which is that we're seeing different fish and different wildlife, and the changes in the actual wildlife in our waterways because of the climate change impact. I mean, we're really changing not just the flora and the atmosphere, but the fauna as well.
Yes, thank you for that, Caroline. So as we all are seeing and experiencing together, from the rise of greenhouse gas emissions, in the Northeast, we are expecting to see more extreme precipitation, increases in urban heat island, as we all know. And these impacts are obviously not equally distributed. They're unequally distributed, and people of color and environmental justice communities are starting to be hit the hardest and will be into the future. So it's really important that we're centering equity in this. And as you can see from the images, this is just from the past 10 years, we're seeing issues of flooding. And often people think of here on the right, which is, the sort of coastal sea level rise and storm surge flooding, like in the seaport. However, we're seeing from Hurricane Irene in 2018, which slammed Vermont, which is nowhere near the ocean, as well as the recent flooding in 2010, 10 years ago, as well as this past year, remnants from Hurricane Ida, which have had extreme flooding from rivers and streams, but also in places not near rivers and streams because of overloaded stormwater systems. So we're seeing the impacts, and a lot of this is going to happen more often. So I'm just going to pass it back off to Dira to talk more about this.
Thanks, Robert. So when we think about climate change impacts and extreme weather, we really have to think about who is being affected, right? So, and these are what we consider our climate vulnerable communities. And what makes a community member vulnerable is typically members that are higher exposed to climate related impacts, such as extreme heat, flooding from extreme weather events, and tick-borne diseases. And members of our community who are exposed to these are typically your outdoor workers, so people who work outdoors during the day, are hobbyists that like to spend their time out in nature, people experiencing homelessness, people living in floodplains, or even people living on upper stories of buildings in urban areas, because we know that heat rises, and sometimes that can be exacerbated when you live in a top floor and don't have AC. Another factor is health vulnerabilities due to age and existing environmental burdens, and that can include air and water pollution, or even just your proximity to industrial facilities. Another major factor to making a community member vulnerable to climate impacts is a lack of economic, social, or political resources, which can increase someone's risk to climate change and also lower their chances of recovery from impacts when they occur. Next slide, Robert. And so as we think about climate change impacts, our climate vulnerable communities, and the solutions and the mitigation part of it all, we can't forget that our country has a history of systemic racism that continues to this day. And if we take a look at this slide, the image on the left shows the redlining map in Waltham, where people were actively denied loans by banks and where resources, included infrastructures, were not prioritized. And when you look at the map on the right, the green is where our minority communities are, and also the areas of yellow. And this is all around the Charles River and also downstream of a high hazard, or the high hazard Moody Street Dam. And so there's really no surprise that these areas today still suffer for environmental injustices. And as we move forward in our work at CRWA, and as well as working with volunteers in different communities, we're constantly working on and reflecting on understanding our role in addressing EJ in our work. Next slide, Robert. And in our watershed, as well as many of our sister watersheds, There has been a lot of landscape changes that influence how we interact with nature. This image on the left here shows you an undeveloped landscape. So there's really not any buildings or any changes to this natural landscape. And when we have these precipitation, a lot of that precipitation will infiltrate back into the ground. Some of that will evapotranspirate back into the atmosphere, and a small percentage of that will end up as runoff into the river or a nearby body of water. But as you know, the city of Boston and throughout the watershed has gone through a lot of development and urbanization. And so when we change a landscape, and you're looking at the image on the right, we change how much of that water precipitation infiltrates into the ground and how much will run off into the closest body of water. And so when we create more impervious surfaces with our buildings and our pavements, we're decreasing the percent that is going to infiltrate, and we're going to increase the percent that can potentially run off into rivers and streams. And it's important to note that, you know, when we do a development or when a development occurs, it will change the natural hydrology, which can increase our runoff and pollution into our local water bodies. But a redevelopment can offer a chance to improve previous development conditions. And at CRWA, we're not necessarily anti-development, although we don't support development in protected areas, but we want to support redevelopment or development that are climate resilient. And so this means thinking about different policies or infrastructure that will make sure that the development is sustainable and we're not causing further harm. Next slide, Robert. So this slide is just showing you kind of the impervious surfaces within our watershed. And the big takeaway from this slide is that where you see these dark kind of brown areas on the map on the right is where our most vulnerable community members are to flooding. And what it really shows is a correlation between where the impervious surfaces are and where the flooding vulnerability is. So that's kind of one of the emerging and also remaining threats that we have in the Charles River watershed. Next slide, Robert. And this is just a really quick graph showing the impervious acres percentage in the towns in our watershed. So you might be able to identify the town that you're from and see what percent impervious it is. And this is a great example of some of the data and tools that will be available for river advocates to use when you advocate for different policies in your community. Next slide, Robert. And so when we talk about impervious surfaces and flooding, another threat to the Charles River watershed is stormwater runoff that can cause pollution in our rivers. So stormwater runoff can typically carry your, different things like bacteria from pet waste, your phosphorus and nitrogen from fertilizer use, oil from cars and salt from roads. And in the case that you have excess phosphorus and nitrogen, that can cause a toxic algae bloom called cyanobacteria in our water bodies. And this can gravely impact aquatic life by depriving the water of oxygen, and it can also be a threat to human health. And so this is one of the major concerns or emerging and continuing threats in the Charles River. Another result of excess phosphorus and nitrogen in our water bodies can also allow invasive species to flourish, which is bad for aquatic diversity and aquatic health in general. Next slide, Robert. So one of the ways that we address this is by advocating for nature-based solutions when we think about development or redevelopment. And nature-based solutions are just conservation or restoration and improved land management actions that can help clean up the Charles and build climate resiliency. So this can include green streets, which include your bioretention or your porous pavement, like you see in the images on the slide. It can also include stream daylighting, dam removals, or wetland restorations. Next slide, Robert. So where can you make change? So when we think about change, many land use decisions are made at the local level. And so this is really where we need your help. So we need eyes and ears on the ground to keep track of what is happening in the watershed. So we created this River Advocate Volunteer Program to get more advocates involved in knowing when plans and policy changes are happening in the watershed, so that we can access more opportunities to advocate for sustainability and climate resiliency in the watershed. And so this is really where we can make where we can start to make change. Next slide, Robert.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thank you, Dira. So you may be asking yourself, how are we going to make these changes in these challenging times and unprecedented circumstances with climate change? And really getting to know people and relationship building is probably the most important part and essential part of organizing and advocacy, as the relationships, the trust building will help share information, collaboration, and getting things done and help build power. And we have a picture of Rita Barron, who was our first executive director. And one of the things she did was meet one-on-one with legislators informally, just to talk and make relationships with people. And that's something that we can still do today. And one way to engage it is to look at your different representatives, as well as meet with people at your city hall or town hall, like the different staff, planning director, stormwater staff, or DPW, or conservation agents, and they can really build that relationship and help give you heads up on things happening and build rapport to help on advocacy. And with this context of climate change, just people may be wondering, like, what is going on today in Massachusetts? And the MVP, or Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, is an initiative of the Governor Baker's administration to help communities prepare for a changing climate. And your community has likely gone through a community resilience building workshop to build their MVP plans. And this planning process often builds upon different plans like FEMA plans, and it really helps allow for communities to get funding for different projects on action grants. And this is a picture of one of those sessions in Waltham. And in the process, they likely identify vulnerable populations, including the different communities listed on the slides. And additionally, as Zira said, we have environmental justice communities, which are state designated census tracts with high population of minority, income, and English isolation, or combination of those. And we have to really think about who was in the room when these plans are being developed. And a lot of the times, it's not representative of the community. So at CRWA, we're having a larger focus on equity, and we want to make sure community members are aware of these decisions and are being aware of the decisions that the communities are making, so that they can be better protected as the climate is changing. Because traditionally, local government really hasn't focused on protecting communities or even engaging. So it's something that a lot of communities need to work on. And one of the most important parts of the plan is that it will identify the different hazards and priority actions the community can take. And that could include things to mitigate flooding, extreme temperatures, like removing a dam, or do green infrastructure, as Dira was talking about. And reading these plans can help get a good sense of what your community is looking at doing for resilience. And now we're going to run the fourth poll to see if you all are familiar with your town's MVP report. And if you don't know if your town has a report, that is also a good thing to know, because it's kind of a wonky thing. It's not something, you would say, oh, I'm just going to go read the MVP report on a Thursday night for fun. I can't see the poll, so I don't know. Dara, you still here?
Yep. So it looks like some of you know that your town has an MVP report, and some of them don't. And one, I don't know if you have a report. Great.
Awesome. And I just want to acknowledge that the MVP plan is not the only important plan that we want to think of when considering climate change. Municipalities have a bunch of plans. I'm not going to read all these, but all these things can include climate smart provisions in it. And if people are interested, we could do a deeper dive on another training on how to advocate for more climate resilience and just climate smart provisions in these plans. But I'm going to hand it back off to Dira to talk more about specific policies that are being implemented on the local level to help prepare for a changing climate.
Thanks, Robert. So at CRWA, we focus on a number of different policies to help build climate resiliency in our watershed. And the ones that we focus on as an organization include trees, stormwater, wetlands, and revenue type policies. So as a river advocate, these are policies that we would want you to help strengthen or implement in your community and as a river advocate, it's really important because you as a community member may know what one of these policies in your community is working on or has a goal to implement. And so we would really like to work together to advocate for them. And if you don't know what is happening in your community, we can also help you advocate or figure out how to find out if your community is planning on any of these codes or bylaws. So next slide, Robert. We have some examples of bylaws that you can take a look at. So an example of a tree protection bylaw, Somerville and Lexington have some really good examples where their bylaws are made to protect mature trees, have a requirement for permits for tree removal, and also provide exemptions for hazardous or disease trees. And this is a tree protection bylaw is typically to help preserve the trees that you already have to make sure that your community is continuing to be or grow in its climate resiliency. Next slide, Robert. An example of a revenue policy. So with the pandemic, there has been a lot of loss of revenues to local governments. And we understand as communities are recovering, that climate resiliency may not be the top priorities for many of them. However, there are opportunities for municipalities to have dedicated funding sources to do important work to prepare and respond to climate change. And so within our watershed, 24 of our communities have what we call a Community Preservation Act. And this allows communities to have a funding mechanism that helps improvements to recreation, affordable housing, open space. Another example is a stormwater utility, which you can create to dedicate some revenue source for staff and stormwater improvements, which can also include green infrastructures. Next slide, Robert. An example of an existing mandate is that we focus on as an organization is the MS4 permit, which is an EPA issued stormwater discharge permit. It's essentially a pollution budget for municipalities that they have to abide by, or their goal within the next couple of years is to reach their pollution budget. And this essentially helps target your phosphorus and your nitrogen and your bacteria so that we're reducing that pollution load into the Charles River and reduce your cyanobacteria blooms and such. Next slide, Robert. Another bylaw that we try and focus on in our organization is Wetlands Bylaw. So communities can also build their climate resiliency by creating a wetland bylaw, or if you already have one, you can also strengthen your local wetland bylaw. So State Wetlands Protection Act does not include climate change into the language. However, as a local government, you can improve your bylaw by adding more climate change language. And so this is another example of something that you, as a river advocate, if you know your community is updating it or making changes, that you can advocate for more climate change language or climate resiliency goals. Next slide, Robert.
Awesome, thank you, Dira. So all these, so we have a bunch of different policies, and we've created a primer in a tool that we're calling the Climate Resilience Toolkit, which is on our website. And it originally was built mainly for elected and local officials, but I really see it as an opportunity for advocates like yourselves to use as well, as a one-stop shop to find all things on these different policies. And it's really a living document that we want to edit and add things. And it's not something that's what we want to say stagnant, but it has examples of model stormwater bylaws, the pre-protection, and other resources that people can use to help advocate for these policies and more. And additionally, as river advocates, another thing we're looking for your help on is weighing in on local projects. We'll go into more depth on this in future meetings, but we want folks to help monitor projects and eventually help weigh in. And as Dira said, new and redevelopment projects have great opportunities to help advocate for climate resilience strategies for communities. And many important projects and decisions are made at the local level, and how we manage the stormwater, how we, how many trees you're going to cut down, the size of them, and how we're going to impact wetlands areas really makes a difference, as they're buffers for the impacts of heat or flooding, et cetera. And weighing in on these projects at the local review levels, we can strengthen the environmental protection and really build that resilience. So, and the other thing is, we don't really oppose projects to protect the environment. Our projects can be built in ways that are more sustainable for environmentally sensitive areas. And there may be some site-specific projects that, like say Whitehead Circle, that are really in a vulnerable area, but that's not something that generally we want to say no projects, because there is a need for these things to happen. And it's really a goal to help build for a future where residents are more prepared for climate change and aren't living in a flood zone. And generally speaking, these are some of the different bodies of the local government that have direct authority and indirect authority on projects at the local level to make sure they're not damaging the environment and our climate resilience. And these different entities at the local level also have a lot of power on different levels for implementing these different policies we were talking about, like say the wetlands bylaw or the tree ordinance. And some of them are not direct decision makers, but they hold political power and can influence the ultimate decision maker. So they're very important, and we're not going to really go into detail on them, but we can sort of park it in the parking lot and talk about it in the future. And I just want to acknowledge that we are in a housing crisis. And when we're thinking about projects, and we want to be clear that this program is not a vehicle to advocate to stop development in housing in your community. CRWA recognized the housing crisis. Even personally, I'm a renter in Boston and am impacted by the high costs of housing, and we need more housing in general and more affordable housing and transit-oriented development to help mitigate the housing crisis and climate change, because having more walkable, dense communities around transit allows for people to walk to the train to go to work, not have to have a vehicle, to reduce pollution from cars and greenhouse gases, rather than driving on the highway by yourself. And there's really no environmental justice without housing justice. Everybody deserves to live in our communities, and everybody deserves to have the opportunity to enjoy the great resources of the Charles River and the watershed communities. And we can also build more housing by protecting the environment and improving resilience if we build in smart, sustainable ways. So we can have it all. So I just want to acknowledge that. So what sort of tools have we developed to help you all in advocacy? So we have a Google Drive, that we'll be sharing with you all later to help share information and collaborate. In the presentations, I know we had a question in the chat earlier. We'll put the presentations on there and share it with you all in recordings. It's a living Google Drive. And we want to help foster community on information sharing in this digital space. So we've created a Google group to share things via email between everybody as well. And the way to share the emails is via the email. You email river-advocates@crwa.org. You'll be able to share emails with one another. Additionally, once folks are to get into the Google group, we'll get you all set up and you'll be able to see all the messages. And if you're not familiar with Google Group, it's a little wonky, but essentially it's like you can email with each other and we can email with you through your email. And you can also look at it through the Google Group website, and you will, by clicking view this group on that or going into Google Groups in your G Drive. And we will add you to the Google Group after filling out the code of conduct and onboarding materials. So I'm going to pass it back to Dira.
Thanks, Robert.
Steps.
Yep. So next steps, if you have felt that this, is something that you identify with and would like to become an official river advocate, the next step will be to sign a volunteer waiver and code of conduct, and this will all be shared in our follow-up email. But if you would like to become an official river advocate, we have a waiver and code of conduct to sign. And like I mentioned in one of the first few slides in regards to our timeline, we are hoping to host another workshop next month and then another workshop in March. And as we recruit more river advocates, we're hoping that when we see, or if we see very specific community goals or groups made, we'll have more specific community check-ins. But if this is something that you would really love to do and participate in and engage with your community, you'll sign that waiver. Our big first step for our river advocate is to review your city or your town's MVP planning report. And we have a link to how you can find out where you can find that. If you can, you could figure out if your community has a climate action goal. See what your community's plan is for building climate resiliency. And we have some resources on our end in terms of the watershed communities. We have data on some of our municipals that we can also share with you as a river advocate. And once you sign your waiver and your code of conduct, that's when we can basically invite you into the Google group, and that's where more of our information and update and communication will be established there. And I know we have only about 10 minutes left till 7, but I do want to allow people to ask any questions that they have about the presentation or about the River Advocate program in general. So if you do, feel free to unmute and ask away. Oh, Robert, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, I'm going to stop sharing. I think, do you want to stop recording, Dira, or?
Oh, sure.
I find it sometimes better, easier to have conversations without recording. For a few of questions.